Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Wherever and whenever you are, welcome to our VWEC Metaverse Expert Series. We are so glad to see you and have you join us for today's interesting presentation and discussion. For those of you who are new, our website, I'm just going to post a link to it in chat, and you can find out more about us. And you can also find more information about VWEC on our various social media channels. And I'll just post a link there too. After our presentation, we will move to the deck for a more informal conversation and social time for those who are able to stay. We are pleased to offer our expert series presentations in both text and chat. Subtitles are available on our YouTube live stream on the link that is being posted in nearby chat now. And you can also find this information in the sign in front of our stage. If you are using live stream, it is important to turn off your sound and close your mic in Second Life so that there is no unwelcome feedback. And also, I would ask everyone else to turn off your mics during the presentation, but you can turn them on again for the Q&A. You should also know that the talk today will be recorded and posted to YouTube, along with all previous expert series presentations. And speaking of signs, we would like to know how you find out about our events. Our survey plant has just a quick survey that is great to help us. And if you would please fill it out and feel free to send it along with any comments you might have. So, thank you all for joining us for this presentation. I am very happy to now introduce our two expert speakers. My colleague, Glenn Loughran, is an artist, educator, and researcher at the School of Art and Design, Technological University, Dublin in Ireland. From 2015 to 2022, he was Programme Chair of the BA in Visual Art on Sherkin Island. And in 2020, he set up the Archipelagic MA Art and Environment in collaboration with ILAN, West Cork Art Centre. This programme uniquely combines post-studio art practice, interdisciplinary research, virtual teaching, island studies, and community engagement. Taking contemporary art's relationship with environments, that means ecological, spatial, political, and virtual, as its object of study. The course instructs students in artistic practices shaped by archipelagic thinking and a pedagogy that is world-centered. With long-distance learning central to the archipelagic reach of the course, teaching and researching in virtual environments is an important aspect. Glenn works across artistic practice, artistic research, and educational research, and is currently developing a book publication on the concept of archipedagogy, which brings together art, education, technology, and island studies. Anne Burns is a visual artist in Cork in Ireland, whose process is embedded in socially engaged practice, materiality, and digital media. She is currently part of the Future Labs residency at Digital Art Studios in Belfast in Northern Ireland. She was an inaugural graduate of the Art and Environment Master's Programme following completion of her BA Visual Art in Sherkin Island. She has exhibited her work at the first XR Festival in Belfast in 2022 and was part of a collaborative virtual exhibition and symposium hosted by the European League of Institutes of the Arts, followed by a digital festival in Potsdam, Germany in 2023. She was artist in residence on the Kinship project for Cork City Council and Creative Ireland. Anne's current work investigates the haptic and plasticity of the virtual space. She explores the everyday through mapping and sensing, using time and sound as material, as well as analysing the body's responses to immersive technology. Her practice engages participants in pedagogical processes that lead to ambitious, collaborative, digital, physical, sculptural forms. She has developed an expanded dialogical approach to art making that enables communities to collaborate and co-produce the work. Anne works for the Cork Education and Training Board as Active Inclusion Support Officer. Part of this is promoting the use of VR as an educational addition to regionally isolated groups, as well as offering an alternative means of teaching and engaging to staff and learners alike. For the first part of this presentation, Glenn will develop a transcritical relationship between education, environment, and technology to support circular frameworks for teaching and learning in XR education. Then, in the second part, Anne will transpose the theoretical proposal onto the methodological ground of practical educational work. This will be followed by a reflection on the advantages and limitations of teaching within the virtual spaces, as opposed to face-to-face scenarios. So now I'm happy to hand over to Glenn.
Thank you, John. It's been a while since I've done this, but I've worked with John probably for about 7 or 8 years in Second Life. And I was a little bit nervous about coming in to do this, but now when I see all the whys coming up, I'm feeling relaxed all of a sudden. So that must mean I am at home a little bit in this environment, which is always a bit of a challenge. So, yes, as John said, I'm going to speak a little bit first from a kind of theoretical perspective on our experiences with virtual worlds on the MA Art and MA Art and Environment. So the aim of this presentation, this first part, is to outline a kind of program of inquiry into the possibility of a critical VR pedagogy. So I'm really interested in how we can develop an education that is motivated by critical thinking, as well as all of the other strands of educational discourse and practice, socialization and qualification. But I'm really interested in critical pedagogy. So the impetus for this inquiry is an educational experiment developed in the master's program. This program, as John has already said, is what's called an archipelagic master's program, which means that it is based in an archipelago. So then it's archipelagic in the geographical and in the geological sense, in that it's located on a number of islands in West Cork. But it's also archipelagic in a pedagogical sense, in that the curriculum framework is built upon a post-colonial theory of archipelagic thinking that positions the archipelago as a generative imaginary for living and studying in climate change and through the Anthropocene at this time. Okay, so this is Sherkin Island. This is where the BA was that John was talking about, and it was from Sherkin Island that we developed the master's program that then moves from and in between other islands. So importantly, within the context of archipelagic thinking, there's this concept of relation that is really operational, and it has a kind of twofold meaning. First, it's about the formation of relationships between islands. The emphasis here is on making connections that broaden our understanding of what the island is beyond its being represented as a radically isolated place that is backward and outside of modernity. Secondly, and more politically, relation is understood as a kind of space where differences occur, where there's intense hybridization around identities and environments, where cultures are made, unmade, and remade. And this is very much based on the theories of the post-colonial philosopher Edward Gleason. So The traditional technology for relating between islands has always been the ship and the ferry and the boat. And within the context of the MA Art and Environment, the ferry provides a relational and a pedagogical dimension in that it offers the students the capacity to move between islands, to study islands, and to develop, at the very least, a comparative analysis between communities, environments, and activities. However, in December 2020, this relational capacity largely disappeared due to the extreme isolation experienced during COVID, when it was no longer possible for the students to move beyond the 3 mile radius of their own environments. An alternative technology emerged as a supplement to the ferry, and that technology was VR. So on the 7th of December 2020, when all the students were in full lockdown in different parts of the country, each of them were sent an Oculus Rift headset with instructions to join a virtual space. And in the place that we used, the platform that we used was called spatial.io, which at that time was in beta, and it was a workplace environment rather than a gaming environment or a social environment, as in social VR, like Mozilla Hubs. It was designed specifically for working environments, and I'll come back to why that's important. So, meeting for the first time in this spatial environment, the students were focused on developing certain responses to readings that they were given. And they were given a specific reading at that time by Edward Glissant on the poetics of relation and asked to develop a virtual installation. With very rudimentary skills, they were very quickly able to visualize and to respond to the text in a very immersive and dynamic way. Following this experiment, we went into a statewide lockdown, which lasted almost the entire semester. And so, as a result of that external imposition, we developed a long-term strategy for using VR environments in the course to connect the students, but also to connect the students to the idea of artistic research and island studies. So over a 3 month period, we developed a number of curricular strands in different VR worlds, including number one, skills-based classes in Blender and Gravity Sketch to support students to develop artworks in VR, a series of theoretical lectures on the concept of technogenesis and critical pedagogy, aiming to give students a more philosophical understanding of the VR experience, a research program connecting the students with islanders during lockdown in ways that enable them to bring the vernacular and locality of islands into virtual reality, and then finally on a kind of expanded European virtual exhibition and conference over a few days that allowed them to present their work internationally and connect in with different speakers from around the world. Through these educational processes, the students were connected within their own spaces and to islands and islanders via interviews and environmental research and archival research. These dialogical experiences were surprisingly fluid, analytical, and generative, where upon entering the students' spaces, you would be met with the experience of island sounds and rhythms, the sound of wind in the trees, bird song, the sea, motorboats, and at different times throughout the semester, you could find yourself in studio spaces having discussions with students about 3D models they were developing that proposed the construction of a floating cinema on the around the islands, floating forests, plant nightclubs, fog harvesting sculptures, audio interventions, and sculptures that represented island experiences during the pandemic, which Anne will speak to a little bit later. But this is just to give you a sense of a culture that was being developed within the spaces. So through these practices, the students began to reimagine the concept of rewilding, or they began to develop a version of rewilding commonly understood as a form of ecological restoration for VR that we began to think about as not rewilding, but rather reworlding. And by reworlding, we mean to bring diversity to a standardized space. And at that time, some of the VR spaces that we were working with the students were very standardized. And what we were trying to do is bring locality, vernacular, and character to it that wasn't already there. So John has a small video that I'm going to ask him just to show. It gives you a sense of something that's really at stake in this idea of developing virtual islands in the context of climate change. And it's about it's a video by the mayor of Tuvalu Islands, which are really threatened by sea level rising at this time. And they have basically begun to develop a digital twin of their islands as a response to the threatened sea level rising. So, John.
Your Excellencies, honored guests, ladies and gentlemen, Talofa and warm Pacific greetings from Tuvalu. Last year, I addressed this August Assembly proclaiming that we must take bold and alternative action today to secure tomorrow. I explained that although we needed global collaboration to end the climate crisis, we in the Pacific would not sit idly by and wait for the world to act. Today I speak again from my country, from a small islet that is likely to be one of the first spots in Tuvalu to be submerged by rising sea levels. Since COP26, the world has not acted, and so we in the Pacific have had to act. We have seen temperature rise projections remain well above 1.5 degrees Celsius, foretelling the imminent disappearance of islets like this one. We have had to take our own precautionary steps with the Future Now project. As our land disappears, we have no choice but to become the world's first digital nation. Our land, our ocean, our culture are the most precious assets of our people. And to keep them safe from harm, no matter what happens in the physical world, we'll move them to the cloud. Islands like this one won't survive rapid temperature increases, rising sea levels, and droughts, so we'll recreate them virtually. Piece by piece, we'll preserve our country, provide solace to our people, and remind our children and our grandchildren what our home once was. This is also a matter of sovereignty. We in Tuvalu are taking bold steps to ensure that our statehood and our maritime boundaries are permanently maintained, despite extreme land loss due to climate change and sea level rise. Our digital nation will provide an online presence that can replace our physical presence and allow us to continue to function as a state. We have been working on these initiatives for the past year, building our capacity to retain and preserve our nation and the unity of our people, even as climate change spirals out of control. Global action must be taken to provide the best case scenario, but we in the Pacific are planning and preparing for a worst case scenario. We need to be able to secure our statehood, our maritime boundaries, and our endowments, no matter what happens in the future. The world's inaction has led our Pacific region to take greater action and forge our own path as leaders on the international stage. But our action alone cannot stop the current trajectory of climate change. Only concerted global effort can ensure that Tuvalu does not move permanently online and disappear forever from the physical plane. Our Tuvaluan culture dictates that we all must share responsibility for the global predicament caused by the climate crisis. Together, we must stop fossil fuels emissions and fossil fuels production and majorly boost financing for loss and damage, mitigation and adaptation measures. It is not just Tuvalu that is affected, but the world is facing extreme weather events and shocking temperatures. Without a global conscience and a global commitment to our shared well-being, we may soon find the rest of the world joining us online as their lands disappear. It has long been the time for action, but we have not stepped up to the challenge. We must start doing so today. Otherwise, within a lifetime, Tuvalu will only exist here. Faftailasi, Tuvalu Moteatua.
Great. And I hope it gave you a sense of something really at stake in this use of VR as a very live cultural tool through which to save traditions and memories and connections. And in many ways, when we developed a similar version of this, we built a an archipelago for the students to work on. Based on the islands of West Cork, a lot of it was around the same motivation to try to see how a virtual world could be used in this kind of way. So just to summarize the first part then, within the context of the pandemic, but also as an extension of this idea of the archipelagic logic of the course, which is all about connection between islands, virtual reality was used as a relational tool. It was developed as a way to make relations between students, but also as relational spaces in which to sort of hybridize standard spaces with island spaces and art spaces and educational spaces, and just really explore the creative potential of all of that coming together. Its main purpose at that time was to negate the standardizing effect of Zoom education on the students and to provide them with a creative environment in which to develop artistic research and island communities. For the most part, this was achieved, although not without its complications and tensions. The virtual environments in VR did surpass the computer screen as appropriate spaces in which to develop pedagogies around the exploration of art and environment. However, once the novelty of the virtual world wore off, there were a number of educational questions that emerged within the group and within the peer teaching cohort. And these were reflected mostly on an understanding of change and the new in VR, an understanding of maturity or educational maturity in VR education, an understanding of what study is in VR education, and an understanding of diversity and complexity in VR education. So I'll just reflect a little bit on each of these before taking us to this idea of a transcritical education for virtual worlds. And as you can tell from some of these questions that are up here, they're quite abstract in nature. They're not very technical, not very instrumental, if you like. And while we did have lots of technical and instrumental questions around curriculum, around learning outcomes and assessment, one of the main issues emerging alongside these challenges related to how an awful lot of the literature on VR education was really reducing it to technicity and to training. And to some extent, this is because a lot of the questions being asked of VR education at that time were being led by economic and technological questions rather than educational or philosophical ones. So in this sense, then we felt that there was a greater need to begin to explore the potential of VR to support non-instrumental, in the economic sense, non-instrumental forms of education based on critical dialogue and critical thinking. So this is just a quote by Gert Baista, who speaks very much about this idea of educational questions and how important they are for what he calls a world-centered education. And he speaks to this idea of educational questions not being just technical, but also being existential. And this is moving away from this idea of the educational question to the idea of novelty. A.J. Bartlett is a key educational thinker on education and technology, and he draws attention to how, in many ways, a lot of the impact of educational questions being led by technological interests is that they tend to make assumptions that the technology and VR, let's say, are inherently innovative, and as a result of that, education itself would also be innovative through the tech. But he argues very specifically for a different understanding of change and novelty in education that is different to that is often advocated for in innovation and innovation through technology itself. And this is a critique that is reflected on in this particular text, especially with regards to sort of the way that the inattention economy infantilizes and sort of reduces our our attention to impulses and desires. And this particular book looks very specifically at how we need to rethink those relationships, especially with regards to institutions, educational institutions, etc. Another key thinker on this idea of attention and inattention and maturity is in education is the French philosopher Bernard Stiegler, and he very specifically focuses on how we need to create sort of technologies of care that support a kind of new type of maturity through education and technology. And he writes about this in this particular text, taking care of youth and the generations. So just touching on some of these sort of key questions that come up for us around novelty, around educational maturity, and then also around what this idea of what study is in the next slide, which really comes from the difference in the types of educational institutions that we might find the use of these kinds of technologies, or VR in particular, taking place. And in particular, the idea of study being something that is kind of outside the instrumental nature of the curriculum. So it is something in particular that this author writes about, Tyson E. Lewis. He writes about how study and studious drift are a very specific type of experience in third level education, whereby students find a level of independence that they don't have at first level and second level. And he talks about this very specifically, let's say, within the context of art education, and that within a structured curriculum, such as the one we developed in the VR program for the MA Art and Environment, you also need to include these kinds of studio pedagogies, which are much more about students tinkering around in the environment in studios. And we did this in the VR program by giving the students access to Gravity Sketch, which is a kind of it was a toolbox for making shoes at the time, but what it came with these large scale studios that the students were allowed to use. So this idea of third level education, if you like, being a very specific place where study becomes a key characteristic of the educational scene, is something that really started to emerge for us to think about. And this is also picked up by this theorist, Lavinia Marin, on the possibility of digital university, where she also focuses on this idea of study being particular to third level education. And she argues that we need to think about what study is or might be within the context of digital universities, and specifically VR and online, etc. And within this analysis, she develops this concept of mediatic displacement, where she argues that one of the things that is really important about third level education is the way that students use tools to mediate different types of thinking. And she takes this also from Wilhelm Flusser, and she argues that, you know, using one technology to think through another technology is something that has always taken place in education. And one of the reasons for this, for instance, she would say even at the level of using a pen to take notes during a lecture is a way of using the technology of the pen to displace the sort of immersive nature of the lecture content. And so the student is creating a kind of distance and a displacement between themselves and the lecture. And that distance that it gives the student is a distance that enables them to think critically at that time. So we were very interested in the idea of how we need to think about the digital technologies that we're using, in particular VR, as not just immersive, but also as sort of mediums for mediatic displacement that enable the student to not be so completely immersed, but actually allow them to think critically within these immersive spaces. So, and one of the ways we begin to think about this is through the idea of parallax, which is very similar to this notion of mediatic displacement. And the word parallax comes from the Greek word parlage, which means alteration. The most common understanding of parallax refers to the apparent movement of objects when viewed from different positions, or for example, when driving on the highway and you look out the window, electrical poles near the road seem to zoom past, while trees in the distance appear to slowly drift by. This is just a Wikipedia quote. However, the concept of parallax that we are taking forward in this project is also based on a philosophical concept by the Japanese philosopher Kojin Karatani, who uses the idea to draw out the unseen connections and contradictions in the work of Karl Marx and Immanuel Kant. In this publication, he explores the critical potential of an in-between stance, what he calls a parallax view, where one view should never be reduced to the aspect of another. So, translating the concept of parallax into this idea of pedagogy, Pauline Schemenschah has argued for a parallax pedagogy that can support technical and subjective differences, contexts, and perspectives. Let me see if I can just summarize. So yes, this idea of a trans-critical framework is a framework that allows you to move back and forward between disciplines, to look at disciplines through the lens of each other, but to ultimately do this in order to create some kind of suspended moment where neither is absorbed into the other. And so we're aiming to do this by looking at sort of different aspects of technology and environment, and in particular islands in this case. And this is just a reference to a project that we were involved in, which is similar to the one referenced previously, on the possibility of a digital university towards a digital virtual university of the arts. And expanding on this idea of a virtual university of the arts, we've put in a number of applications that would begin to test out this idea of a trans-critical pedagogy for virtual worlds. And through an exploration of this methodology, we aim to open up a process of inquiry into the relationship between virtual and natural worlds, which places the learner in an unfolding space of critical dialogue. Seeking neither synthesis nor contradiction, the project aims to focus on an essential ongoingness between both physical and virtual worlds. At stake within this proposal is a critical and creative engagement with the decolonial concept of worlding, and in particular this idea of a world-centered education, one that replaces the instrumentalized objects and outcomes of learning with a trans-critical engagement in virtual and natural worlds. This analysis will be conducted with a diverse range of teachers and students from countries and cultures across Europe, and through an array of educational spaces, physical and virtual. It will aim to produce a better understanding of blended learning methods for immersive realities, and aim to expand on the curricular content of environmental education, particularly through what we're calling intersectional environmentalism, which is a framework that enables teachers and students to gain a deeper awareness of climate issues and the various ways that social and political identities such as race, class, gender, ability intersect with climate concerns. So just to finish up then, in many ways, the students had already begun to do a lot of this kind of work whenever they looked to Reworld and Rewild VR. And we're going to really expand on this sort of metaphor of the virtual archipelago through the trans-critical methodology, and in particular to look at it through a kind of phenomenological approach, which will take much more specifically the spatial environments in which we work. And through this comparative analysis, we'll focus on the similarities and differences between virtual and physical realities in key educational forms, such as spaces, gestures, and practices in the classroom. And that leads me on to the next section, where Anne Burns is going to reflect on these challenges a little bit more in her own experience of VR teaching. Thank you.
Thank you, Glenn. Hi, everyone. Yeah, I'm Anne Burns, and thank you, John, for having me here to speak this evening. So, yeah, I hope to expand on Glenn's inquiry a little bit with regards to the more practical applications within the virtual classroom, both as a student, working with Glenn, as I say, as he said, through the BA and the MA, and as a facilitator myself now. But I thought I might start by presenting my master's research piece, of which there's an image there on the slide, called Rhythm Analysis Plus, which evolved in a way that was quite unexpected for me. I'll be showing you some slides as we go along too, and refer to them briefly as we go through the talk. I will begin though by bringing you all back to that period where we tend to lose a sense of time. I know I do anyway, within our memories. COVID-19 catapulted us all into a multi-layered presence where many of us tried to coexist, I suppose, in a parallel reality in order to maintain our everyday work and social communication. In general, the arrival of Zoom and online learning brought new rules of switching off your camera while feeding your dog or your cat or having a shower, something we would never do in reality. Questions needed to be answered around how the environment might determine the behaviour of the students and how we should present ourselves. I suppose it opened up possibilities for education and social platforms, and for me, this is exactly what happened. As part of the master's programme from TU Dublin, the inaugural run of Art and Environment, as Glenn mentioned, brought teaching online to a very, very new level. A hybrid of web-based discourse and hands-on presentations began to change as we began hacking the space with the use of VR meetings in Spatial I/O, a gaming and meeting and educational platform, more of a gaming place now. Avatars were created, and though we were geographically isolated from one another, the meetings in these spaces became very important in our weeks as they went by, and moments in time where a definite physical presence was experienced by us all. Underpinned by Edward Glissant's archipelagic thinking, as mentioned earlier, we ourselves became islands in a new archipelago, transposing through disciplines of learning, maintaining a new presence while being separated, and interacting in this new alternative existence. So I know we might double up a small little bit there. I have a few other images, and this is Sherkin, and just a small map there on the bottom right of where it's located. So it's at sort of the southwest coast of Ireland there, a small island that is about 5 kilometers squared. And at the time when we studied, there were 93 inhabitants there, but this has actually doubled in size now that we have so many new Ukrainian visitors. So anyway, yes, as a socially engaged practitioner, I wondered how my own interest in the everyday rhythms of human existence might begin to evolve in this unstable type of environment. Early in the semester, we had been set the task of creating an exhibition proposing possible island projects, which you saw images of there earlier on screen. Within the West Cork archipelago, there are many islands, but we had focused on 3, and they had been divided up between us. I had been assigned Sherkin, the island that I was most familiar with, having studied my BA there and built up many relationships with islanders. And as part of this proposal, I decided to interview 4 islanders using Zoom, and I had asked them to consider their sensory rhythms as they each attempted to navigate COVID-19 on their own small island off the west coast. It was my wish to engage these people as empathically as I could. It was a very important part of it for me that they found something themselves that could really catch their own imagination and help them to move through this very difficult time where all people's mental health was quite fragile. The islanders, they walked the roads daily. They knew every twist and turn and every message that nature sent, alerting them to the weather, tidal or animal behaviours. They recounted bats skimming by at twilight and the pain from the salty air as it almost cut their skin as they walked around each bend. These were their cyclical rhythms. Days turned to nights and weeks to months. They were asked to record these changes. We had no expensive equipment, and they only had their phones to catch the visuals and the sounds to illustrate these stories. Each day, my rhythms fed into island rhythms, and I started to examine the everyday through this lens using Henri Lefebvre's framework of rhythm analysis to scaffold my research. It needed to be brought to life, and I was interested in pushing the technology to see what I could achieve. And this took me back to my Zoom recordings. I too was confined to home, but lucky enough to have a space where I could work. I had some drawing materials. No shops were open, so there was no materials to buy. And all I had were some brown paper sheets and some natural drawing materials. And I settled on using charcoal, chalk, pencil, water, and earthy pigments. In turn, I listened to each of the interviews, and I began to respond in a drawing as they spoke about the wind direction, meanderings to the church on the hill, and daily walks to the pier as they collected essential food supplies. Each detail was documented, and gradually they became a kind of graphic score in describing their individual rhythms. They were then analysed by attaching sound and using a variety of computerized software programs. A soundscape evolved. Still uncertain as where it would lead me, this sound map became the basis of the work that I brought into a virtual reality app at this point. So the work itself, to begin, the images of the maps were dropped into a web platform, which is difficult to describe, I suppose. Gravity Sketch, I think Glenn mentioned it there, it's like a drawing or designing app, and that was my chosen VR platform. Once visible in the space, my laptop was set up in my kitchen and casting what I could see within the headset and recording the work itself then through QuickTime. So I had a sort of a layered sense of working within it. I inserted some earplugs, connected to my phone, and began to play the 5-minute sound piece that I created, containing island sounds and ethnographic content. It played over and over to simply hear and feel what I wanted to see. At least 5 versions of the work were created. You can see some of them there. Before settling on the final piece, it became really overwhelming with choices about effects, scale, colours, and this really started to begin to take from the richness of the social input, which I felt was the most important part. It was essential that it remain a socially engaged project and to maximise the input of those who helped me to create it and to maintain that integrity. It was divided into segments, and I worked by focusing in on each of the individuals and their rhythms. Beginning by listening only to the sound of the Atlantic, I found that the colours from the individual maps, now suspended in the virtual space, had connected directly into the drawing system. And if one was chosen, it was then possible to draw using the colour palette from that one image. This then allowed me to focus completely on the voices, the stories, the island, and to simply draw in 3 dimensions using the full scope of my body, moving to create a meaningful response without distraction from colour or effectual choices. Each interview was listened to individually and focused upon using the data from the map from which it was drawn. Over 6,000 lines and strokes were created, and what developed was a 360-degree cartographic line and soundscape that encapsulated the sensory rhythms of these 4 islanders during the global pandemic. Once the drawing was complete, a new set of questions needed to be addressed. As an inclusive artist, I hope, it was important that the work had multi-means of access and that it did not give anyone a sense of feeling nauseous. There was still a fear of the technology, and I certainly met with that when it was first exhibited, as people were concerned that it might just be a game. Within the headset, the drawing was set into a black void, disconnecting the viewer from reality, and it was rotated at a rate slow enough to view without risk of motion sickness. The sound piece alone allowed a person with a visual impairment to visualize the sensory nature of the piece. The mobility of the work also allowed it to be seen by a wheelchair user or brought to another venue. It was difficult at the time to define exactly what I had created or we had created. Was it still a socially engaged piece when no face-to-face or hands-on exchange had been completed? In my mind, it could not have been finished without the social input, and it was reliant on each individual and their daily rhythms that they generously shared to make this project happen. It felt like a performance that needed to be choreographed. All the elements were there, but through direction and the expanse of technology, something different was created to tell the islanders' story in a new and immersive way. Landing into virtual reality, as I did through the Masters, also impacted on my employment status as active inclusion advisor with the Cork Education and Training Board in the further education sector, which is the piece in between secondary and tertiary education, for those who might know. A new road was beginning to emerge, using VR technology as a teaching tool. As I seemed to be the only one with this experience at the time, I suddenly arrived as the expert, which was not at all true. However, I was probably the least afraid and the most willing to test the space. I introduced a life skills course to at-risk teenage students, which was aimed at turning their heads away from black mirrors and outwardly towards their communities. As a small reward for engaging with this first module, I offered a second one in a virtual space. This consisted of 2 short workshops where they needed to engage with sounds and smells in their local environments and bring the data into spatial I/O, adding exciting new elements where they could redraw, recontextualize and scale their information, creating something new and exciting and meeting them where I believe they're at. This took weeks, as it took time initially to set up headsets, accounts, avatars, and design contracts of agreements with the teenagers. It was easy to achieve a buy-in with the young people. I received a very mixed response, however, on introducing this technology to staff members. I put it out to 2 audiences. The first was to show staff a project that I had been a part of as one of 7 countries on an Erasmus Plus initiative called VET Reality. This was to create an e-compendium or toolkit to teach staff how to use VR with special education needs students in preparation for work-based learning. Many staff members found it quite overwhelming and felt it an unnecessary extra device to introduce. The other group of staff were those who volunteered to attend from a youth reach sector, which would have been the youth reach, the at-risk teenagers I mentioned earlier. This sector would also take in a very large element of neurodiversity, and they found it to be very successful as they continue to explore it today, very much so. Coming back to my experience as a student, I refer to a classroom environment that was once presented to us back on the BA by John, as we were brought to Second Life, a Second Life space that had been created by TU Dublin in our second year, I think, on the BA. It was a replica of a classroom, and I thought afterwards about how the meeting might have gone if it had been presented to us as a rodeo arena or a strip club. As it was, luckily, we knew how to behave ourselves, apart from one student arriving naked on a horse. It did get a laugh, and it was rectified, as we all understood in this environment that we were to sit, face the lecturer, turn off interruptive sounds, and have respect for those who spoke. As this developed to the aforementioned spatial I/O, we had been somewhat prepared, but there were further immersive challenges that faced us all. Creating a sense of place and presence is crucial to hold the attention of the group. How could this be achieved in such a scenario? Was it not an illusion? The work we produced certainly was real, and our discussions were real. Our emotions were certainly real. Were we grounded enough in our own home spaces to feel safe in this new one? There had to be an element of trust present and a sense that the students were being held carefully in that space without them knowing or understanding what students were really going through. We were, in fact, guinea pigs, I suppose, in a lab of our own agreement, of course, but there was a feeling amongst the group of fear and uncertainty. As a facilitator of such spaces now, I feel that it is incumbent upon me to be aware of the unseen within the space. When you teach or facilitate work, you rely mostly on the voice of the student, and the movements of the avatar that the student wishes to convey. You have no real visual reference, and that is something we rely so much upon in the real world. There is a knowing around social interaction, around respect and simple manners. These things are transferable, but with eyes focused on the sense of space rather than the physical one. As a guardian of that space and those within, I believe that a two-way contract needs to be agreed. Rules can then be set according to the task, the environment, the students, their mental health, their physical capacities, and other possible parameters may be unseen or unthought of. The rules may change as the environments change or tasks. In these unstable environments, we need to be more fluid, I think, with our approach. There are so many positives to this. It's not all doom and gloom, of course. There are many emission-saving advantages. People can visit classrooms and workspaces all over the world now without limits within their headsets. A deeper understanding of more diverse cultures can now be reached without the restrictions of weather, travel, and more of a concentration on our carbon footprints. People can see the world now and may not have the capacity to move from their homes either through physical disability, age, economics, or time. Virtual reality can now assist with emotional and physical well-being trials all over the world, as its uses stretch far beyond the gaming world. More discussion always leads to more learning, and isn't that why we're here today? Virtual environments can give us more agency when used well. We have taught each other new skills and developed pedagogical models and updated them through the ages. It is simply time maybe for us to look again and to keep questioning. Thank you. Actually, John, have a small clip of the work that I created. It's not as immersive, but we have that YouTube clip. It's a very short version of it. The full version is 5 minutes, but this is just a very short clip to give you an idea of the piece, if people would like to see it.
Always a breeze when you're kind of walking. It's kind of covered over with the trees and that, and then you're kind of, once you go up past the hill, up over the hill, and maybe just a bit closer to the beach, yeah, you taste the salt, like.
So, can I throw this open to the floor for questions, and please feel free to either put questions in the nearby chat or to speak them in voice, whichever you're most comfortable with.
I do have a couple of comments and a couple of questions. First off, I want to applaud both of you. Just as a suggestion, I would personally like to set up a meeting where you talk with the Anthropology Institute, because I foresee the ethnography you did, and is absolutely fantastic, both of you actually, okay? And this is the future of ethnography. And while all ethnography doesn't have to be done through anthropology, you have done excellent research, and this is the way anthropologists need to think about in the future to help communities document their culture, their language, etc., and how to do it. That will be, the keystone there. And while, Tom Bukowski's really busy, maybe he can give some tap into it. But I personally, because I'm here in Santa Fe, I would, I am myself the Anthropology Institute to meet with you and to watch this before a group of anthropologists so that the ideas can be disseminated throughout, the American Anthropological Association and the Society for Applied Anthropology. That's my suggestion, because you have done excellent work. And I want to applaud you.
Thanks for that, Shiloh, and we'll follow up on that.
Thanks very much.
Really, this is something, it needs to go beyond just the borders of Second Life into anthropology, and how anthropology students can use the ethnographic method for the future. Okay. Secondly, I was looking at the cost of the Meta glasses, and they're like half the price of the Oculus that you have, and people have already been using the Meta glasses. They're like under $500. And I also saw that Google has contracted with Ray-Ban to create a type of VR glass too. Maybe you've seen aware of that. So maybe as educators, this might be very good for you because it'll bring the price down of the, the technology so that you can use it in classes and when you're doing research. If I can ask this before we go too far, while you were talking, I had put down, I don't know exactly what a gravity sketch is, but what you were doing, it was very interesting to watch this and cite, because you work with musical notes and everything. Maybe you're more familiar with it. But another question comes to mind because I attend Sheila's virtual world education roundtable, and one of the things that she does address is archival work. And have you also thought about how all of this is going to be archived and retained? How do you, this is wonderful as a documentation to retain identity, like, John, the clip that you showed us about the islanders losing their island, but how can they be certain that 20, 30, 40 years from now that is still going to be there? And there's a problem with it too, because if you think about the hula that the Hawaiian Indians talk about, they had great apprehension about videotaping the hula because they said the hula is like a language, it constantly evolves, and they were afraid of videotaping because it would make it seem like that was the correct way to do the hula and that the hula is not adaptive. So these are questions that I would have when you're documenting. What do you do for language change and culture change? But secondly, how do you archive all of this and keep the digital copy? What do you do with it?
So Glenn, do you want to try and address Shiloh's question?
I appreciate the enthusiasm for the ethnographic potential. I'm wondering what you mean by that. Well, like what is it specifically that you're seeing in it that is ethnographic in the sort of intersection with islands and islanders? So it's quite it is quite challenging to engage traditional communities in these kinds of technologies. So I'm wondering what you are seeing of value in the presentation for ethnographers. I'm really interested in what that is more specifically than, it looks like ethnographic research because it's islands, which has a very...
No, it isn't just islands, but moving forward, we're moving into this age of AI, and anthropology students today are like going, I don't teach, I'm trained in anthropology, too many graduate classes, over 17, okay? Anyway, there has been a question, kind of like a tenet in anthropology, where is anthropology going to go? But if you take the ethnographic method and do what you're doing, trained as ethnographers, but also then into this type of technology that you and Anne have used to address salvaging some of the cultures, this is something that anthropology students and anthropologists should be very well aware of. Visual anthropology was a growing field, which, to use to document things with images, but now you can get it moving. You can get the sounds, you can get the seascape, you can get place put in the ethnography, which you both have done, which is excellent. That was my only reason for the ethnographic method expanding. And that's why I'm suggesting that you talk to both anthropology institutes. And the Anthropology Institute here is like 117 years old, which is why I would, help you knock on the door to get in touch with them. But with the American Anthropological Society and the Society for Applied Anthropology, I think both of what you've done is very relevant. That's all I was saying about that. Okay, but for the archive, this is something that even Val has brought up, because you're working into the digital age and what is a digital citizen, etc. you know, and you're talking with traditional groups of people, and it's hard to get them to buy into the technology. I'll have to send you a clip that I found when, I think it was Canon or Kodak, went in and they found traditional group of in Africa, or maybe it was on the islands, I don't know, and gave them a camera. It was very interesting to see what the islanders did with that camera, with that piece of technology, and what they visualized as important. It was very, very creative, okay? So there is the option that you can bring your islanders or whatever group of people you're working with, urban, whatever, and let them work with the technology and what they see as important, as opposed to you, the outsider, sees as important and should be documented. But I like what you're doing because you get the sound, the texture, you get the feeling of the wind coming through, and that's important. But Vale and Sheila would ask you, how are you going to retain this document so that it's of use 20, 30, 40 years from now?
You might like to say something on a comment from Delia, which she's really interested in the kind of sound cartography, if you like. And you might just talk a little bit about that.
Sure, yeah, I just also wanted to comment firstly though on the archiving of it, and even as Glenn knows already, like I've already had some issues with preserving the piece, and I'm currently working on reworking it, and that sort of happened for a couple of different reasons. You know, in changing the technological parameters of different devices, even from one year to another, you know, changed with the development of the technology. The piece didn't transfer from one onto another, and in a very short space of time, you know, that's a big concern to me. So for me to actually archive this, it's very important for me to I mean, I mentioned that I wanted it to be to have many access points, multi-access points, so that it would stand alone as a sound piece, that it would stand alone as a visual piece. But I realize now that it also needs to be written down, you know, it needs to be recorded in another way, and perhaps in a 2D way, you know, for all those reasons, in order to archive it in a variety of ways, because as we all know, you know, I mean, we find it more difficult all the time at home, even to play cassettes, which we have many of, you know, and every time we buy a new piece of equipment, you know, it's harder to get something with the cassette in it, you know, in order to play our cassettes, which we don't always want digitalized, you know. So I just think it's a good point, and very important to address that point of archiving things, you know, in a suitable way. We can't see the future, and how, I mean, we were told that CDs would be almost, you know, just super proof, and clearly they're not. So, you know, things are always changing. The soundscape, sorry, what was the question about the soundscape, John? Sorry.
It was really more a comment from Delia, that just, she said she was intrigued by the idea of that sound cartography. And Delia has built a phenomenal, as I said earlier, Delia did all the landscaping here, and she has an expertise in that area, so it's all authentic. But
yeah, you were talking about
just say something about the sound cartography.
Yeah, I suppose to me, each one of them was a map, and because I suppose as an autistic artist myself as well, also like sensory, that the whole idea of sensory is super important to me, and I wanted the sound to be as much of a visual map, like an aural map, as the visual piece is a visual map. So that is where that sort of term came to fit for me, and I really wanted people to see it in the aural as well as the visual. Again, as well as I say, as an inclusive artist, it needed to be as strong as an aural piece, and to be that map of their lives during this time. And I guess there was so much going on for people with regards to their mental health. As I said, it needed to be something very positive for people to focus on, as people were really confined to such a small space, and for them even more so on the island, cocooning on the island. So I suppose the whole idea of mapping and sensing had become very much part of our learning, and working within the islands. I suppose the cartographic symbol was most appropriate, if that sort of answers the question or helps
Thanks.
examine it.
If I could add here, we have, as part of this consortium, a community of the virtual ability, and we have people who are sight limited. And so I've been trying to add to the builds that I do the sounds that would enable people who have limited sight to be able to get a fuller appreciation and understanding and experience of some of the environments. So you've got me thinking about a whole lot of different things I could start to work on that I hadn't thought about before, although I do have sounds in each of them, not
Yes.
the same as what I think you're getting to.
Yeah, it's very interesting, isn't it? Yeah.
I want to bring in, which might be a final question, but Ariel has been trying to get this in for a while. Glenn, he's interested in the decolonial approach, and he's asking if you think that suspending disciplinary boundaries as a possible entry point to consider how VR could be decolonized. For example, dismantling the binary of real versus virtual could carefully be applied to analyze if and how the relationship between race and technology could be decolonized or not.
Yeah, I would completely agree with that, and that's something that we want to try to do more of, which is look at the kind of biases that are built into virtual environments in the way that they're constructed. But also we could say the same thing about virtual education, the biases that are built into way it's understood or promoted, actually, you know, the way, you know, it's promoted to certain groups and sectors in a very specific way. You'd be surprised that most educational theorists and philosophers don't come across the discourse on virtual worlds and virtual reality as much as we do in design and in yeah, corporate spaces. So but I do think that there's a lot of potential for some of the strategies that are inherent to or developed within post-colonial thinking to be used to address some of the binaries that are being set up, the assumptions that are being made about what education is in a virtual space. And in a way, that's what we tried to do with archipelagic thinking to some extent. In the simplest of terms, archipelagic thinking is about always crossing borders. It's about always being on the move. And so in that sense, it moves away from thinking center periphery and tries to think more in a kind of patchwork fashion. So I do think, yeah, if the question is can these strategies and theoretical frameworks help us think differently about these spaces and do different work, I think they can.
Thanks, Glenn. Okay, I'm going to finish up with a comment, an interesting comment by Shiloh, which might open up a future discussion. But Shiloh suggests that maybe this kind of technology lends itself to a multidisciplinary degree approach. And I would agree with that. And I have some examples of it that we could talk about at a later stage, but I'm very conscious of the time. It really is time to wrap up the formal part of the event. And I really want to thank Glenn and Anne very much indeed. Your insights have been fascinating, and your generosity in sharing is very much appreciated. So please join me, everybody, in applauding our guest speakers today.